I do want to start just a little bit early. I'd like to thank Russ Hahn, who had close to 50 years with Cornell University and has provided the majority of the information on weed control in the Cornell Field Crop Guide. I'd like to thank Jen Thomas Murphy, communication specialist, who's been integral in pulling off these webinars. Brian Brown, who is our first speaker in the series from New York State IAPM. Carrie Marshner, an extension associate with weed ecology at Cornell. Mike Hunter, a crop specialist from Northern New York, Cooperative Extension Regional Ag Team. Janice Degney, Ag Program Leader and Crop Specialist from the South Central New York Cooperative Extension Ag Team. And finally, Lynn Sosnoskie, who is our speaker for today. Lynn joined Cornell University in 2019 as an assistant professor of weed science, focusing on weed biology, ecology, and management in specialty crops. She has current research programs identifying herbicide resistance in horseweed, pigweed species, and lamb's quarters, and is actively investigating novel weed control technology for weed suppression. So this is going to be a lot of fireworks today. She has a lot of good information. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn and ask her to share her screen.
Thanks. I think Jen wanted to run a poll originally, and just we're interested in knowing if you have herbicide resistant weeds on your farm, or if you think you have herbicide resistant weeds on your farm, because I'm going to talk about the current status of herbicide resistance in New York State. It's a little bit more widespread than we'd like to be. And also, herbicide resistance is really driving the development of new technology for weed management, including a couple of the tools I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And we're going to talk about herbicide resistance and, again, novel weed control technology. So the problems with weeds. These are the obligatory slides I use at the start of every talk. Is weeds are competitors with crops that result in yield loss. But they have other impacts on our crop production environment. They can actually reduce harvest efficiency. They just impede the movement of equipment or manpower. Weeds like dodder or mistletoe parasitize crops. They can be hosts for pests and pathogens. They're dangerous or noxious or poisonous or hazardous in their own right. And they can disrupt ecosystem services. One example is Medusa head out in the Western United States that's completely disrupting fire cycles and causing significant problems out there. But again, we tend to think primarily about yield loss as being the most significant impact of weeds in our production systems. And this is just some work that the Weed Science Society of America's Yield Loss Committee has published. And what they did is that they went and looked through the literature, and they looked and said, if we employ best crop production practices, but don't use herbicides or don't engage in weed control, what kind of yield loss could we expect to see? And it's significant for our dominant crops, anywhere from 50 to 70% yield loss if we don't manage weeds, equating to hundreds of millions of dollars per year in economic loss to billions of dollars of years in economic loss. So really, since the 60s and 70s, herbicides have been applied to almost 100% of our crop production acres, particularly corn, soybean, and cotton, which are our dominant commodities. But they aren't always effective, and herbicides fail for a lot of different reasons. They might fail because you chose to use the wrong herbicide, or it was applied at an incorrect rate or spray volume, or improper use of spray additives. Antagonism and other spray solution issues are not unheard of. Weeds are just too tall at the time of application, or they're too stressed to be effectively controlled, particularly with our systemic products. And then there's environmental factors that can affect herbicide deposition or activation. And then what I'm going to talk about today, which is really the driver of a lot of our new technology, is herbicide resistance. And herbicide resistance is a significant problem in the US and worldwide. Right now, there's 509 unique cases of herbicide resistance across 266 weed species. In total, somewhere in the world, we have resistance to 164 herbicides. And the United States leads the way with respect to herbicide resistance development. We have 123 cases in the United States. With respect to New York, Jeff mentioned Russ Hahn, and Russ Hahn basically did all of the work that has been done to date or published to date on herbicide resistance. And you can see this. This is the results that he found, mostly that we have resistance to our photosystem 2 inhibitors, primarily to atrazine, cyanazine, and simazine. But since Russ is retired, not a lot of work has been done. But we know that this isn't the extent. This isn't the end of our herbicide resistance, because we know that horseweed, we know that waterhemp, we know that palm amaranth, we know common lamb's quarters are not responding to our chemical tools. So I'm going to update you on some of the work that I'm doing to document herbicide resistance here in New York. Specifically, the work we're doing with horseweed, with waterhemp, and with Palmer amaranth. So in 2021, your cooperative extension specialist really helped us out and helped us collect horseweed seed from around the state, all throughout central, eastern, northern, and western New York, from 30 different populations. The majority came from agronomic fields, but we did get some from roadsides as well as orchards and vineyards. And what we did is we brought these seed, we cleaned them up, and we planted them out in the greenhouse, and then screened them against what we would call the usual suspects for herbicide resistance. So that would be Roundup, glyphosate or glyphosate-based products, as well as first rate and classic, which are ALS inhibitors and have been important tools in soybean production systems. And what I'm going to tell you is this is what we found. So the higher the bar, that's going to indicate that we killed more plants with these chemicals. So that would indicate susceptible populations. Lower bars or no bars mean that those populations are exhibiting signs of resistance to these chemicals. And what you can see with few examples, a lot of our horseweed populations are showing signs of resistance to Roundup, to first rate, and to classic. And a lot of you might have experienced this or observed this in the field. What's really interesting is two of our populations, 7 and 9, which came from a vineyard and an apple orchard. The managers of those sites said that these populations weren't responding to paraquat. So they were attempting to control them with paraquat, and they were not killing their horseweed plants. Now, we know that paraquat resistance has been reported in Canada and California, but there's a lot of factors that can influence herbicide efficacy, particularly with paraquat: plant size and timing, rate, GPA, and coverage. And then there's environmental factors that can influence success. But I do want to let you know, and we're working on putting out a formal publication, is that we've run greenhouse trials 3 times. And basically what we're seeing is resistance in these 2 populations to 2x and 4x rates of paraquat when we're applying the herbicide to plants that are the size of about a quarter, so fairly small, and under greenhouse conditions, which enhances sensitivity. So with respect to the pigweeds are significant problems in multiple cropping systems throughout the US, and that's going to include important cropping systems that we have in New York. Pigweed species in general are problematic, but you can see that in soybeans and corn, water hemp and Palmer amaranth are being purposely separated out as being common and troublesome. And we have these two species here in New York now. So US populations of water hemp and Palmer amaranth, water hemp's on the left, Palmer is on the right. Yeah, we have real concerns because we have populations in the US that are resistant to the ALS inhibiting herbicides, the photosystem 2 herbicides, the PPO herbicides, HPPDs, very long chain fatty acids, as well as glufosinate, dicamba, 2,4-D, and Roundup. So that's a lot of chemical classes that we're very reliant on that we have resistance to somewhere in the US. Now, with respect to New York, we know that water hemp is a little bit more widespread. That's the graph in the yellow. It's found in about 12 to 13 counties in New York. I do feel that we have a real concentration here in central New York. Palmer amaranth is still somewhat limited here in New York. We have it in 4 counties. The Wayne and Seneca County populations are pretty small, but the Steuben County and the Orange County populations are much larger, and these are the ones that we're working with in the lab for screening. So with respect to the water hemp resistance screening, again, we evaluated the populations using classic, first rate, as well as Roundup. Higher bars indicate susceptibility, lower bars indicate resistance. And what we're seeing is that certainly with the classic and the first rate, highly resistant populations of water hemp, even though we are seeing 40 to 60% injury from Roundup in these populations, I can tell you they outgrow that injury. They might be slow to grow out, but they do. So we do have resistance to glyphosate here in New York. This was done with one population, the Phelps population, but we are screening at least 12 other populations this summer, and I truly expect we'll see the same results. So with respect to Palmer amaranth, this is the Steuben County site. You can see a plant on the right that was damaged but not killed by a herbicide application. The plant on the left was controlled. Again, similar responses. Again, we still saw injury, even a little bit more injury than we did see with the water hemp population. But I can tell you, these Palmer amaranth populations were starting to grow out of the injury responses that we observed. This was injury ratings taken at 2 weeks after treatment, but by 4 weeks out of treatment, they're starting to recover. So again, we're worried about these active ingredients here in New York. So our results suggest glyphosate, ALS, resistance in all 3 populations with additional paraquat resistance in horseweed. We have screened the Palmer and the water hemp against other active ingredients such as Reflex, Callisto, other products that glufosinate that could be used in our different production environments, and they look like they're exhibiting sensitivity at this time. We were able to completely control them at all rates. So it looks like our resistance right now is limited to the active ingredients that are shown on the slide. We are doing other resistance screening. We have populations of common lamb's quarters not responding to Vasogram, populations of common ragweed not responding to Stinger, and then potential resistance to Linuron and PPO inhibitors in Pal Amaranth. I just want to let you know that resistance moves, particularly with these species in the landscape. Horseweed has a seed much like dandelion seed, and it can get caught up in wind currents, moved into the planetary boundary layer, and then dispersed across the landscape. And this is just some information. This was all done at Penn State and at the University of Delaware, is that they were able to, they took like a small plane that they flew up there and they collected seed from different points in the atmosphere. And they found that horseweed seed could be found at 134 to 459 feet above ground level. So it's getting moved upwards via wind currents. And if we assume wind speeds, in the planetary boundary layer, I didn't convert it 20 meters per second. They believe that seed dispersal could easily exceed 310 miles. So the seed are moving up, and then they can be moved across the landscape with wind currents a great distance. So for instance, paraquat resistance in one location might not stay in one location if a lot of seed are produced and it's disseminated. Palmer amaranth and water hemp seed are small and they can move around on equipment. I wrote an article for the Cornell Field Crops News about weed seed movement and the need to clean equipment to prevent moving resistance between fields, between counties, even between states, on harvest or other field equipment. And I just want to share this slide. There was a grower in New York who bought a harvester from the Midwest US, and the cooperative extension specialist went over that harvester with a fine-tooth comb, and he was able to get 200 seed off of that equipment. And that seed was sent to us here in Geneva, and we grew it out in the greenhouse, and it turned out to be water hemp. So this was seed that came from the Midwest, from where they have water hemp infestations, to New York. And we then grew this out, and we decided to screen these plants that grew out for resistance to commonly applied herbicides, including herbicides that we know that water hemp is resistant to in the Midwest. And these are the responses that we saw. Now, I think the Rely, the Ultra Blazer, the Extendamax, and the Embed responses, the plants were a little big at the time we sprayed. So I don't know that we have true resistance in these populations, but we just didn't have effective control. But based on what I was seeing, I do think that we were looking at resistance to the impact, the Callisto, the Reflex, again, the Classic and the First Rate and the glyphosate. Every herbicide with a blue arrow above it, these are herbicides that in the Midwest, we know water hemp can be resistant to. So just to suggest that we could potentially be moving new resistances in on equipment that we're buying from outside of New York, outside of the region, or if you have resistance in one field, we could easily be moving equipment, or be moving resistance on equipment between fields, from clean fields or from infested fields to clean ones. The extension specialist is working with this grower to make sure that we do not see water hemp popping up in this county and on his field sites. Also, there's pollen flow. We know for Palmer amaranth and water hemp that herbicide resistance just doesn't move on seed transfer to site. We have herbicide resistance moving by the movement of pollen. These species have separate male and female plants. So they have to outcross. They have to have pollen move from a male to a female to have fertilization and seed production. And we've done multiple studies, and I've been involved in some of these studies that shows that these genes can move from resistant males to susceptible females, and then the offspring will have a level of resistance. So it's not just seed movement, it's also pollen movement. So everyone asks, where is the new herbicide? So when are we going to get the new herbicide for control? This is the timeline of herbicide site of action released in the new in the world, and you can see, like in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we had a flurry of herbicide discovery and development and commercialization, and then it stopped. We maybe got new active ingredients, but truly new modes of action, new chemical groups. We haven't seen one for a long time until just recently, when the new Group 28 came out. And the Group 28 right now, that herbicide is registered for use in rice. So where's the new herbicides? And I'm going to tell you, not sure. Herbicides are really expensive. In 2008, the cost of discovery and commercialization was about $246 million to bring a new synthetic pesticide to market. Weed scientists are discussing whether we actually have, how many more biochemical target sites within the plant cells are there for us to be able to develop new products to. And then there's debate about whether consolidation of chemical companies is helping or hurting innovation. Some people suggest it's going to reduce competition, but because our chemical companies are consolidating with seed companies, there's now also a potential desire to investigate novel trait technology and to maximize that potential. So people have been arguing either ways. So I think what we can say is we should not be necessarily relying on a new herbicide to come down the pipeline to save us, so to speak. Again, the FMC Corporation, that Group 28 product that's coming out now, it's going to be for use in rice. And then the next announcement I heard is a new potential mode of action coming in 2030 from Bayer. Other considerations associated with herbicide use, obviously there's injury concerns. Dicamba has popped up throughout the United States, particularly in the Midwest where sensitive crops, and that includes non-tolerant soybeans being injured by drift movement. There's carryover issues. There's just application issues that can lead to injury. And then there's changing consumer perceptions and regulatory hurdles that could limit potential herbicide development and registration, and an increasing interest in organic agriculture, and that includes here in New York. So we're going to move on to new technology and discuss some of the research that we've been doing here in New York, and some of my colleagues have been doing throughout the United States. And the first one we're going to talk about is electrical weeding. And electrical weed control is just what you would imagine, controlling weeds by applying an electric current directly to unwanted vegetation. What happens when you have this electric current applied to weeds is the flow of electricity through the plant just generates heat. And that causes water in the cells to vaporize. And what happens is when that water vaporizes, it expands and tissues burst and then die. This is not a new technology. It's actually quite old. The first patents for electrical weeding were issued in the 1890s. And then there was a lot of work that was done in sugar beets in the 1970s and the 1980s. There's been a resurgence in the technology and really renewed interest because of the development of herbicide resistant weeds, and in specialty crop systems, rising labor costs. A lot of specialty crops can be very dependent on hand weeding. So looking for tools, particularly later in the season, that could reduce weed pressure or without needing to rely on humans and hoes. So one technology that we're looking at, a specific unit that we're looking at, and this is a unit that's commercially available in the United States, is called the Weed Zapper. What it is, it's a tractor-towed PTO-driven generator, and it produces electricity that then charges a front-mounted copper bar. So weeds that get above the canopy that come into the contact with this bar, and you can see the bar on that right picture, are electrocuted. So this is the current models that the Weed Zapper has available in the US. And again, to my knowledge, this is the only company. There are electrical weeding companies throughout the world, but this is the company that's currently operating in the US. This is their Annihilator series models. Their smallest ones are sold out for 2022. This just gives you the idea of the watts that can be generated, the size of the boom, anywhere from a 15 to 20 foot boom up to a 40-foot boom. But then also the horsepower that's required to the PTO for the tractor that needs to run the generator. So in 2020, we received the Farm Viability Institute grant to partner with some grower owner operators here in New York. So growers that have weed zappers to look at electrical weed control on the weeds themselves and also on crop injury potential. 2020, we're going to do observational studies to identify factors that influence weed management success or failure. And then 2021, do replicated field trials where we manipulate, say, weed density, weed size, the type of weeds present, and run these replicated trials based on the data that we captured in 2020 to say, yes, you know what, this is where the weed zapper will be effective, or, no, you know what, it's not going to get these species particularly well. Because of COVID, everything had to be delayed for a year. So what was supposed to be done in 2020 was really done in 2021. And this coming year, we're going to do our manipulative trials to test hypotheses. So just to show you some examples of what we did, we worked in both beet fields out in Western New York, as well as soybean fields. The growers that we worked with grew both specialty crops as well as agronomic crops. In the beet field, the left side of that picture is a hand-weeded section of beets. The right-hand side of that picture is basically that was getting too expensive, and COVID, they didn't have enough manpower. So they switched to using the electrical weeder on the beets for the remainder of the field. On the right, that's an organic soybean field where the electrical weeder is used. And what I want to do now is just share some individual species observation data. So what we saw, so we went to the fields, we walked them routinely, we took reports about weed control, crop injury potential, any kind of important information that we felt, really highlighted success or failure. We also collected biomass. We collected biomass from a certain number of weeds throughout the field and compared electrically weeded fields and a non-weeded section of the field to see if there were any changes in weed injury and size. And what we did see is with some common occurring weeds is we saw reductions in leaf and stem biomass per plant. So smooth pigweed, velvet leaf, common ragweed, we saw anywhere in 61% to 84% reduction in plant size and biomass. So we definitely saw injury. Now, some people have asked questions about, are you actually reducing yield loss? Are you affecting, the competitive interactions? Or is this just a salvage operation? Are you just trying to improve harvest efficiency, just reduce the amount of stoppage you might have because the weeds are too dense? Or are you trying to prevent or reduce seed production? So with respect to reducing yield loss, I think maybe in specialty crops with smaller canopies like beets or cabbage, where those height differentials between the weeds and the crop are pretty significant, where things like common ragweed or lamb's quarters or pigweeds get above those canopies very, very quickly, I think it could be used for yield loss, preventing yield loss. That's something we're testing this year. But it does reduce weed density at harvest, and it can reduce weed seed production, and not only that, weed germination. But this isn't going to be a standalone technology. It has to be part of an effective and diverse weed management program, whether that's herbicides, whether that's cultivation, whether that's another strategy. So this is just an example of some of the work that we're doing with velvet leaf. We collected velvet leaf seed that was produced after the electrical weeder was run through, and then seed produced before electrical weeding. And you can see the difference in seed size and the difference, a total amount of seed, or the total weight of all the seed that was produced. So when pods that formed after an electrical weeder ran through, there was just not enough energy going to the development of seed, and the seed were shriveled. They weren't as well defined as seed that were produced before the electrical weeder ran through. So seed that are already formed on a plant before weeding is done might not be affected. They might be insulated, and we might not see the reductions in production or viability, and I'll show that in the next slide. But electrical weeding could impact future seed production. So this tool would be really good if you can get there as soon as these plants are starting to throw up flower heads, and make sure that it occurs before seed production takes place. So these are the same seed lots where we started germination assays. You can see that velvet leaf seed on the right, this was seed that was already produced and formed in the capsules before electrical weeding was done. You can see it starting to germinate. The seed that was derived from capsules that tried to, flowering, that tried to occur after the electrical weeding. Again, these plants were really damaged, and there just wasn't, we believe, enough nutrients to support, the generation of well-formed seed. So trials that we're going to do in 2020, we're going to be evaluating them in a lot of different systems. So snap, dry, soybeans, beets, and cabbage. We also got an OREI grant, an organic research grant, and we're looking at an electrical weeder that's specifically designed for use under grape and tree crop canopies. So we're going to be doing studies in fruit crops as well. We really want to know how specifically the type of weed is going to affect performance. I can already tell you, based on our observations from 2021, grasses do not respond as well as broadleaves. They are much, much, much more difficult to control. And again, annuals versus perennials. Particularly large perennials, are going to be much more difficult to manage. One of those soybean fields had hemp dogbane in it, and we didn't do a thing to hemp dogbane. We got all the broadleaf annuals, but a woody species like hemp dogbane, we're not going to see that same level of success. We want to know how fibrous versus taproots could affect weed control, weed size, and weed density and arrangement. If you cut into a really thick cluster of weeds, you're going to have less current going through each individual plant, and that is going to affect the dose that each plant receives, and it's going to reduce the efficacy. And again, we're interested in weed control, but we're very interested in what this means to seed production and viability. The soil type and the moisture content is going to affect conductivity, and that's going to affect weed control efficacy and crop safety potential. We want to know who survives and who doesn't, and how this could drive changes in weed community composition. When we're also interested in system impacts. So what is this going to do to soil microbiome communities and insect communities? And I have a graduate student who's actually going to be working and answering those questions specifically. So again, we talked about the Weed Zapper. These are available in the US. There are other companies out there, particularly in Europe, that are looking at electrical technology for weed control, crop zone, Zaso, root wave. Again, not all available in the US. I do have a Zaso weeder. That's what we're using in our fruit crops, but there's no commercial sales in the US right now. And I'm really been talking to another colleague about the crop zone electrical weeder as well. There are automated weeders out there. in the US, again, not necessarily for New York markets or for New York commodities, but I want you to know that there's automated weeders, GPS guided or tracted mounted automated vision guided weeders that are in development. So with respect to automation, there's two components needed for weed control. That's detection and then actuation. So you've got to be able to see the weed, or at least differentiate it from the soil background or from the crop. And you can differentiate it from the crop maybe by the size of the plants that are present. Hopefully your crop is bigger than your weeds are, ideally, if you're going in to manage. Crop row patterns, some of the artificial intelligence and the active learning is detecting a crop row pattern, and everything that isn't in that row gets eliminated. And then there's true machine learning, where the different organizations, the different industries are actually saying, it's taking pictures and it's training the weeders to say, this is a crop because it looks like a crop. It looks like soybean. It looks like cotton. This is a weed because it specifically looks like Palmer amaranth or water hemp or foxtail. So there's the detection component, and then there's the actuation component. Once you see it, you've got to get rid of it. And so you can either spray weeds with herbicides to remove, or you can have some sort of physical removal strategy or some way to damage weed tissue. With the physical removal, it can be knives that are cutting the weeds out. I've actually seen a unit. It looks like a little claw that just comes down and pulls the weed out. And then there's some people investigating propelled grit or lasers that actually are target the weeds themselves to damage the weed tissue. The unit I'm going to talk about is, it differentiates weeds from soil, and then it sprays the weeds with herbicides. And the system that I have in my lab is called a Weed It. And this is a newer iteration of Green Seeker technology. Basically, it detects green on brown. So it detects chlorophyll fluorescence. There's absolutely no image processing. It just sees something that's got chlorophyll in it, and it sends that information to solenoids, and those solenoids turn on the nozzles. So this is being commercially used right now in fallow dry land production. So there's no crop present. So this is a very non-selective system, right? It's not separating out weeds from crop, but it can be selective under certain conditions, and I'll explain that next. It's being used in fallow dry land production. It's being evaluated in row crop systems by coupling the sensors with a shielded sprayer. So it just sees weeds between rows and then sprays and protects the crop from potential drift. We're also investigating it in fruit systems where we have a canopy that's raised up above where our weeds are growing. And that's the system that I'm using it in. And this is my system here. The left is actually a picture, a colleague of mine in New Jersey. He's looking at it in blueberry. His picture is just a little bit more clear than my picture. But what you can see on the right-hand picture is there's different zones. You can see the blue line, that is the sensor, and that there's 4 different sensors, and then there's different zones, and each sensor is associated with a different nozzle. And if the sensor picks up chlorophyll in say the zone that's closest to the person that's standing there, it'll open up only that nozzle to spray the weeds in that zone. If it detects weeds in all the zones, it'll open up all the nozzles, and it wouldn't be much different than, say, a banded or broadcast application. So in 2021, we're evaluating this system in grapes. So we're interested in weed control, crop safety, and how much we can reduce herbicide use. 2022, we're going to be doing the same trial, but now we want to see if we can use it to actually see suckers in grapes. Can it actually detect suckers? And can we use the vision-guided sprayer for sucker control so we don't have to do directed applications? We can just turn on nozzles where the suckers are and reduce our drift potential and reduce our herbicide use. And then also studies to look and see if, how weed size, weed density, spatial arrangement of weeds, the type of herbicide we partner with the system, herbicide rate, and then any kind of background interference like leaves or twigs that might tip off the sensor, and kind of pruning trash could affect the performance of the equipment. Right now, just want to show you some work that we've done with Palmer Amaranth and with horseweed, is that right now our vision guided sprayer, this is in very artificial trials where we plant the weeds specifically and arrange them purposely. Right now, we're seeing the exact same results with respect to weed control using Rely herbicide with the vision guided sprayer and the backpack sprayer. We're getting the same amount of control in both instances. We did the trial with horseweed, and again, we're pretty much seeing the same results. Again, we've only got 1 year under our belts. We're working on it. But right now, again, we're getting equally effective control of these weed species. And I don't have that data right now, but in our grape systems, we saw less injury to grapes using the shielded spray or the vision guided sprayer versus a traditional banded application. So we talked about the one I'm using, but again, there's a lot of technology out there that's differentiating the crop from the weeds based on, again, size, patterns, or machine learning, and then removing weeds using some other strategy than just chemical technology. One example is the FarmWise. This is actually out in lettuce fields and in other production fields in California. It looks like a tank. It's actually been scaled down a bit. This was a prototype. It's fully autonomous. And it's computer vision guided, and it is actually doing image analyses to tell weeds apart from the crops themselves. And then when it actually sees the weed, it has a little knife that goes in and just cuts the weed out. So it's image analysis for detection and differentiation, and then selective physical weed removal. Not only is it doing that, it's also collecting data about the crop development and growth stages and where the weeds are. It's collecting that all data, and that's being provided back to the grower to optimize forecasting so they know what stage their crop is at with respect to harvest. And it's also that kind of information can also be useful for developing weed maps within the field. There's a lot of companies out there that are looking at vision guided or automated technology, and there's different levels of sophistication. This is just some of them. For agronomic crop systems, Blue River technology they were just recently bought by John Deere the past couple of years. This is, I would say, perhaps the system that's really most actively working in agronomic crop production systems. Mostly right now in the Midwest and the Mid-South in those soybean and cotton environments. But again, there's a lot of companies out there. The last thing I want to talk about is weed seed control at harvest and harvest weed seed destroyers. So this all developed in Australian systems because they have a really significant problem with Italian ryegrass. This species has developed a resistance to 14 different herbicides sites of action, and populations in Australia are confirmed resistant to up to 6 different sites of action. So what we mean is there's a single population in Australia that is resistant to 6 herbicides at one time, or 6 herbicide groups at one time. So they were really feeling the pressure to find alternate strategies for weed management. And one of those strategies was to manage the weed seed bank. And what they found is that their Italian ryegrass seed, 95% of it was being, when they were harvesting their grain fields, they were harvesting the ryegrass seed, and it was being retained in the chaff fraction, and they were just throwing it back out onto their field. So they were just doing a really effective job at harvesting the seed and distributing this weed seed. And so they started developing different strategies to deal with weed seed and weed seed residue. And so that was using chaff lining and windrow burning or baling the chaff for livestock feed to try and remove the amount of seed that's going back onto the field. So using this strategy to just reduce the numbers of weeds that they would have to deal with. A more recent development that they're been actively investigating and commercialized, and we're evaluating here in the US, is basically moving the chaff fraction and the seed that's associated, the weed seed associated with that, through impact mills. And these impact mills are either towed behind the combine, or they're actually now, the most recent ones, are integrated into the combines themselves. And what it is the chaff and the seed are passed through it, and this impact mill just crushes it. And it just spits out crushed material back onto the field, or at least crushed seed material. And it's more expensive, certainly, than just chaff harvesting or baling or lining systems, but it reduces the amount of post-harvest chaff handling. You don't have to go back in and windrow burn or baling that chaff. And it also retains harvest residues for soil and water conservation. But what they're doing is you're retaining these residues, but you're crushing the weed seed. So you don't have viable weed seed going back into the soil environment. So is this going to work in the United States? And I have a lot of colleagues right now who are investigating this. And the first thing they needed to do was determine if the seed of our most common and troublesome species are being retained on plants at harvest and are being picked up and moved by combines, and then determining how effective these impact mills are at crushing and destroying the seed, both alone and if it's mixed with chaff, because that chaff could potentially cushion the seed and prevent seed destruction. So again, I've got a bunch of colleagues out there that are doing this work. And actually, I meant to take this slide out. This one has a little bit more data. So we do see work that's being done with seed shattering or seed retention at harvest. And what it does is it actually can vary very much based on the species. So Nita Soni, the work she did with downy brome and feral rye and jointed goatgrass, you can see anywhere from 70 to 90% retention of that seed at harvest. And then weed seed destruction. So that seed that was retained, when it was run through an impact mill, they were able to destroy 98% of it. Lovreet, my friend Lovreet Shergill, he also looked at weed seed destruction using impact mills and looked at water hemp, giant and common ragweed, ivy leaf morning glory, smooth pigweed, Jimson weed, velvet leaf lamb's quarters. And he found those species 85 to 100% destruction when the seed were run through an impact mill. With respect to seed shatter, though, I'm going to tell you it's very much dependent sometimes, not only just the species you're looking at, but where you are in the United States. Seed shatter was lower in southern latitudes as opposed to northern latitudes. So what that means is the seeds were being held on the weed plants more in the southern latitudes than in the northern latitudes. So there was a greater chance, if you were in a southern state, that those seeds would actually get harvested and pass through the combine and then pass through the weed seed destroyer. At northern latitudes, when it was time for harvest, fewer weed seeds were being held on, but it also very much depended on the species. So there's a lot of interactions between the weeds and the timing of the equipment, or the timing of harvest and the equipment used. And what I can tell you is there is a very, very, very large study that's being done right now in the United States to look at the potential use for chaff lining and the use for these weed seed destructors for reducing weed return to the seed bank and to improve weed control in subsequent seasons. It's a multi-million-dollar project. Some of the work is being done at Delaware, some is being done at Virginia. If I can find $46,000 and a grower with a John Deere harvester, I can join into. Right now, it's the $46,000 that's kind of holding me back from joining in that study. So just a summary, weeds are bad and herbicide resistance makes it worse. Our problems are only growing, and herbicides might not always be our solution. Novel technology is increasingly available, and I just want to let you know that university weed scientists, we're starting to get our hands on this equipment so we can test the tools and provide stakeholders with, feedback saying, yeah, you know what, it works here, here, and here, but not here, here, and here with our replicated research trials. I want to thank you. Extension support was provided by Smith Lever Funds. The herbicide resistance screening is being provided by federal capacity funds, specifically hatch funds. The New York Farm Viability has been supporting our research on electrical weeding. And I also have USDA funds supporting the research into our vision-guided sprayer work. So please be sure to put your name and your certification number in the chat box again. You're going to need this. And I'm going to leave this slide up for all CCAs for getting their certified crop advisor credits. And if there's questions, I can answer them.
All right, thank you very much, Lynn. There was one question that came up earlier, and it related back to the zapper.
Yes.
And its current use, as described, is for escape weeds. The question was, do they see formulating a way to use it, within row to control weeds at an earlier stage, like to take the place of an example, some of the burners that are out there, the flamers?
So, yes, there are. There are implements that are under development that will be tested. There is nothing commercially available, but it is technology that is being investigated and that we will be investigating this coming year for this very reason. And I think it's either the crop zone or the root wave. And I think it's the root wave technology actually does have electrical weeders that go between the rows and do that. And they're very low to the ground, kind of like almost like a mower. And Zaso has a unit that I believe they have a unit. I could be misspeaking that maybe that they're developing in South America. I cannot be 100% sure. So this is definitely, the use of this technology is definitely been discussed and is being explored in that fashion.
So some of the reading that I have done related to some of these products, especially those that are employing cameras and artificial intelligence to identify specific weeds, and then to direct an herbicide spray to those individual weeds as it passes through the field, that one of the things that I see as, a barrier in field crop production is the rate of speed. How many acres per hour can be treated because of the need to identify those weeds? Can you comment on that? Yeah,
so that really, the processing power, you're talking a lot of data and a lot of information that needs to be captured and then needs to be processed, and then the speed with which that information is relayed to the actuator. Yeah, it's a lot. I can tell you these units are moving a little bit faster than you might expect. I don't remember the actual speeds. Probably not as fast as in an agronomic system. that growers would normally be moving with traditional spray. But that is something that Blue River Technology is certainly addressing, because again, they are active in that arena. But for instance, I don't remember which company. I just saw a talk last week. I was at the Western Weed Science meeting, and another company was talking about that, and they were actually getting their speeds up faster, and they actually had to change their nozzle angles because their processing power was improving so that they could move at faster speeds, but they needed to angle their nozzle slightly backwards now because of the slight delay in the actuation process, so that they could hit the weeds, because again, they were moving a little bit faster, that they were now missing the weeds because of the way that the nozzle was angled. So so that's it. Not only is it how fast can we move in the field, how many acres can we act on, for return on investment. The other thing is particularly with the autonomous units, how long are those batteries going to last? And so there's also components of battery development that are being factored into their production and their use.
The one benefit of those autonomous units is they can work night and day. It really doesn't matter to them.
Yeah, and so that is the thing, is that they can work night and day. And even actually the vision guided sprayer, even my sprayer, is not dependent on sunlight. Now, granted, it's attached to a unit. For me, right now it's an ATV, but it's attached to tractors. But because of the chlorophyll fluorescence and the wavelength, you could operate after dark. Conceivably, and still spray successfully. I will tell you though, with where you said they can operate, after dark and on their own, is one thing that we don't think about is regulatory environments have to keep up to date with this technology coming out, because right now in California, I believe a lot of these autonomous weeders are regulated like the self-driving cars would be, autonomous vehicles are. And therefore, you have to have an operator in certain proximity to the unit. So it's not like you can just sit there with an iPad and a fleet of 5 units out there by themselves. So we have to make sure that regulatory environments, as more autonomous technology develops, keep up with the needs of agricultural systems. And also, a lot of these units collect data that the growers can then use about their crop size, crop development, weed numbers. So we have to have broadband and cellular infrastructure for the data capture and relay.
So we were talking just prior to the start of the meeting about how certain wavelengths of light are also now being used to control weed seeds. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there, in addition to the physical destruction with the harvest weed seed destroyer, the impact mills, there is a company out there that's investigating about whether different wavelengths of light can be combined at obviously a higher intensity than normal sunlight, to penetrate the weed seeds and disrupt cellular activities, cellular processes that could render the seed, damaged and reduce germination in the future. That's still exploratory, but it is being looked at, and then there's discussions about what would the energy use look like relative to an impact mill? So impact mills are out there and are being investigated by university personnel, but other technologies for destroying weed seeds, such as this kind of directed energy or laser, is also being looked at.
Thanks, Lynn. I also have read some articles recently in the Popular Ag Press where they have used the technology in the field already. So these are the smart units that use cameras and AI to identify weeds and direct spray to individual weeds in the field as they pass through the field, that there's a reduction anywhere from 75 to 90% of the herbicide compared to a broadcast spray. I just wonder what your thoughts about that are. One of the things that I have in my mind is, well, okay, so they still have to cover the entire field. If this is a custom applicator that's invested in this product line, they're going to have to charge to cover the entire field. So there may
Right.
not be savings, economic savings from an application standpoint. Obviously, there is from a quantity of herbicide used. Any ideas about that? Thoughts about that?
Yeah, so obviously that is a discussion. A lot of this is also focused on, with increasing regulatory environments, again, public perceptions. If we can do the same job but use less product, there being kind of a social gain in the system, and hopefully an economic gain, but a lot of that is still being determined, right, by economists. So another thing I do want to talk about is right now, our labels are not designed for this kind of technology. You don't want to be saying spot spraying, because spot spraying is very nebulous. So our labels, as this technology comes online, our labels need to change with how we discuss how products will be used with vision guided sprayer units. So there's actually a bunch of regulatory issues that are going to have to be associated with how herbicides can be used with the equipment from a label standpoint. So I will just throw that out there.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. And that's a really interesting comment. And that's probably going to have a lot of ripple effects in industry and in government. One of my thoughts back to that, 90% reduction in actual herbicide active ingredient being applied is that really opens up the door for a whole new marketing campaign. You can't call it organic, especially if people are using synthetic fertilizers, but it would be, let's say, a new approach and maybe a new way to hit the marketing.
Yeah, and it could open up potentially new chemistries if you have if that use is associated with increased safety, because you don't have to do an over-the-top application, or but again, there's going to be label. there's a whole new realm of label, considerations that have to take place. Yeah, but I could see where someone could say, could use it as marketing tool. We've got biodynamic, regenerative, organic, and not that they're just simply marketing tools. They might have, they have associations, and designated with them, but it is a potential classification, again, that we don't even fully maybe appreciate or understand yet.
Thanks so much, Lynn. This is a question that may or may not be in your wheelhouse, and maybe, Mike Hunter can comment on this. I know that the New York State legislature has been looking at some bills that reduce availability of certain insecticide and herbicide products. And the question from Joanne Delaney was, in New York State, have homeowners lost the right to purchase Roundup? So I just wonder if, Mike, if you have heard anything related to that or not. And I think the simpler question is, were they considering making Roundup a restricted use product, which would take it out of the hands of homeowners?
I'll let Mike talk about New York regulations. I will say that I have heard that I believe Bayer wanted to do away with a homeowner line. That's what I've heard. Again, I don't operate in the homeowner realm, so I am really not certain about about that system and what's available and what isn't.
Yeah, Bayer is in the process of taking Roundup or glyphosate out of the hands of homeowners. It's not taking place yet, but I think it's going to be possibly 2023. But they're working on doing that.
But that also, there's a lot of companies, that also have that active ingredient. So that's one component of the system. I know Bayer does supply a lot of glyphosate to other companies. So what effect that has, I don't know.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for speaking today.